Side character spin-off movies are perhaps one of the biggest hit or miss prospects in film today. Pretty much a feast or famine scenario no matter what way you look at them. You get introduced to a fun and exciting character in the context of the main series, they're probably just a side character, not the main focus. Just there to enhance things and give a bit of extra added flavour to the storylines, and often, because they're so fun, they get super popular as a result, and people are clamouring for more of them, their toys are selling well. People are hyped, and this can often lead to them getting their own spin-off show or movie. We've seen it so many times in the past, and often this would be kept as a direct-to-video sort of thing, and range from pretty decent, like Bartok the Magnificent, the 1999 spin-off prequel to Anastasia, like seriously that movie has no right to be as good as it is, and then there's stuff like Kronk's New Groove, the 2005 direct-to-video sequel of The Emperor's New Groove, which I presume was made to try to capitalise on the huge demand for the original film on home media release. And yeah, it sucked, and it's not well regarded either by critics or by audiences. And that's really the big example of a massive risk that these sort of films take. You take a character that's extremely funny in the small doses you get them in this instance it's Kronk, and he has so many classic scenes and lines in the original film. But in the end, he's the sidekick to Yzma. He's a henchman, and ultimately, he gets far less focus in the main film than Kuzco, Yzma, and Pacha. And so when he does get his moments, they feel fun, they feel fresh. But the problem is when you give him his own film and make him the focus, he became overexposed and his jokes became tired simply from oversaturation. And then eventually it went from home video straight up to cinematic releases. On the negative side, we have things like Cars 2, which pushed Lightning McQueen to the side in order to focus more heavily on the character of Mater, a rusted redneck tow truck, who I'll admit is funny enough in small doses in the first film, but in the second film gets embroiled in a super spy plotline, becomes the lead character, and is massively overexposed. To the point that Cars 2 in my eyes is probably the worst Pixar film of all time, and it's not close. I only watched the film once, but I felt like it was just agonizing by the end. You laugh at the first couple of jokes because it's Mater and he's funny, until he becomes tedious simply by being there way too much. But that being said, there is one character that seemingly managed to avoid this fate in his spin-off appearances completely. And that character's Puss in Boots. Like seriously, just look at the reception to his two films. The first film, in 2011, got a Rotten Tomatoes score of 86% for critics and 68% for audiences, which is not too shabby if you ask me. And the franchise also has a 95% critical score and a 94% audience score for the second film. Massively well received there. And on top of that, both of them did rather well at the box office. Don't get me wrong, they weren't pulling prime Shrek numbers, but they still did well for themselves. The first one brought in $555 million off a budget of $130 million, whilst the second brought in $485 million off a budget of $110 million. So it's a lesser gross, but it still did become a sleeper hit. And it does make you think, I can't believe that they'd intended for these movies to be direct-to-video originally. Like, my god. Sometimes it does feel like Dreamworks is just allergic to good business decisions. Good thing they realised their mistake before it was too late and changed tack, because most of their films outside the really big names, they do not bring in this level of revenue. So their poor financial situation during the 2010s would have been made even worse as a result. But enough about that, we gotta keep going. Back to Puss. So we can see here that audiences responded well to the Puss in Boots spin-offs, even when the reception for Shrek as a whole started to turn as the franchise began to stagnate. I mean, realistically, there was nowhere to go. For me, even Puss in Boots had become somewhat tired as a character. He was awesome when he was introduced in Shrek 2, but over the course of Shrek the Third and Shrek Forever After, I felt like he lost his luster. During those films, it's not that he became overexposed, but I kind of think maybe his character just became a bit flanderized and overly silly. He lost that X factor and became a purely goofy comic relief sidekick. But then that first prequel film dropped and the character felt different. They were approaching it as an origin story, and so he couldn't be what he was by the end of Forever After. But at the same time, there seemed to be this sort of understanding that for him to lead his own film and for it to not suck, they had to add depth to the character. They had to give him motivation, develop his more sympathetic qualities, keep some of the goofiness, but bring back the edge he had during his introduction in Shrek 2. Maybe give him a love interest to play off, a connection with his adopted mama, different dynamics with different characters, make him heroic and strong and yet guarded, a bit closed off. And in that way, I think the character became a whole lot more complex. The story itself was good, but I think the best part of the film was the development of Puss's character, fleshing him out from just a side dish to a main course all of his own. And so in the aftermath of his film, I'm kind of surprised they didn't take advantage of this brand new world they could explore, this fresh version of the character, keep moving him forward towards the point where he goes off to far, far away and becomes the cat that we know from the main Shrek series. Instead, Dreamworks decide to make timeless classics and box office sensations in the form of Turbo, Mr. Peabody and Sherman, Home, Captain Underpants, Abominable, and many more. And so it took like another 11 years or so for this sequel to even hit screens. From 2011 to 2022. That's a long time between drinks. That's longer than the gap between Shrek 1 and Shrek 4. And so I do think they missed out on a lot of story potential, because honestly, now it is too late to go back and fill those blanks. We've moved on, story's moved on, it is far less of an appeal. But that being said, I think it has played out somewhat in their favour. After all, they released The Last Wish. And yeah, whilst it didn't make as much money as the first one, the reception was far more positive. And what I found impressive was they managed to take that sort of flanderized version of Puss, the one we see develop over the 3 mainline Shrek films he appears in, and they use that to tell the story. About how it's part of his flaws at the start, how he'd become too goofy, too reckless, too silly, losing his serious edge and becoming a YOLO type of character. It's a stark contrast to his heroic persona that we see in that prequel Puss in Boots film, and also just different to his darker portrayal during the course of Shrek 2. But they use this to pivot his character into one that realizes that he's wasted the last part of his life, that it's potentially coming to an end, he's gonna die soon, and now he's out of chances. And this allows him to pivot into a more emotionally complex character, whilst also restoring that heroic vibe that he had in the first Puss film, whilst also keeping around a lot of those aspects of his personality that did develop during the Shrek franchise. And of course, this is all leading into a soft reboot of the Shrek franchise, as at the end, he and Kitty and Perito are going off to far, far away to meet up with some old friends. Shrek, Fiona, Donkey. It's pretty clear from watching the film. And so in the end, I think this is probably one of the best examples of how to craft a spin-off centered around a comedy side character. You can't just keep them as they were. You need to flesh out their persona, their dynamics. You need to give them narrative depth. Otherwise, you pretty much have nothing at all. And so obviously, we are going to be seeing Puss in Boots again, and Kitty, and whatever. They're going to be in the Shrek franchise going forward, and I assume they're still going to be doing those films. They're not going to get cancelled. I hope not. It's been a long time. And they're a big money spinner for the studio, and I want that nostalgia hit, you know? I just think this is something the studio sorely needs. They are still very hit or miss in the box office. But with that being said, the question I want to pose here is, beyond Shrek, is there even room for another Puss in Boots film? Could there be a third? Or have we hit the end zone for that particular franchise? I mean, ultimately, there's always more potential for more storylines. That is true. The world they inhabit is one big interconnected fairy tale land. The majority of their storylines, they've had a very European-style focus, and even then, there's many untapped European fairy tales that they could explore with these characters, but you could even go beyond that to other cultures. But ultimately, for me, that's kind of secondary. Look at the 2 Puss films. The first one, yeah, the hunt for the golden goose was important, but the character arc of Puss and his interplay with Kitty and Humpty, that was the most important thing in the movie. Then again in The Last Wish, yes, the goal of the characters converging to try to get their hands on the wishing star, that is important. But the major through line in the film is Puss and his fear of death and how that shapes his actions and the story. And so I guess what's become clear is that the story's largely secondary here. In these films, it's the characters that matter more. When the characters stop growing and stop developing, it doesn't matter what the story is because the characters have become dull. They have that aura of been here, done that. And I do think that's what happened to Shrek the first time around. And it's taken over a decade for it to feel like it's time to freshen things up and bring it back. Puss is going to be fine in Shrek because he's not the main character. He's there to be a side character and he'll be a very interesting one. And I think with his new personality and dynamic, it's going to make for a very positive addition to the group. But for a standalone film just based around him again, I do wonder whether he's reached the end of the line. How much more does he have to give as a character? I mean, maybe I'll think differently after we see how Shrek plays out, but for now I'm kind of content with his solo adventures ending like this. His character was rejuvenated. But also it did feel like a massive ending in a way. They finished the film with him going back to find Shrek and the others, linking his standalone series back into the main franchise and passing back the baton in a way. Like, I'm not 100% on that score, but I think they found the perfect way to wrap it up. I wouldn't be against seeing a Puss in Boots 3, but it has to ensure that the character continues to grow and doesn't become stagnant. And right now, I'm not sure they can do that realistically. I could be wrong, but that's just what I think for now. And so, Yeah, not really much else to say beyond that, so I'll just remind you that these have been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of the Puss in Boots franchise? Do you agree with me that they're the gold standard for side character spin off movies? Or maybe you think they suck? What do you reckon the future of the franchise holds? Is there going to be a third film in the saga? Or do you think he returns to just being a Shrek supporting cast member? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.